Hello, students. Let's move on and talk about the Mexican Revolution, and hopefully, we will have time to finish all of this up by then talking about how all of this plays into U.S. immigration policy so we can really lay the foundation for the remainder of the unit. Okay, so the Mexican Revolution, I want you to first just pay attention to the date range. In history in general, most students, at least I didn't when I was in school 18 years ago, I never learned about the Mexican Revolution. I don't know if it's because we were not as close to the Mexican border growing up in Pennsylvania, but it's sort of a shame if you think about it, because this lasted far longer than, let's say, the Russian Revolution. This is a period that it seems to be overlooked. So that's what I'm trying to get at. But let's not overlook it anymore, shall we? So this was a really violent, cataclysmic upheaval that lasted almost a decade, and it resulted in over 1 million, 1.5 million Mexican deaths. And most of them did not die directly from combat. They died because they lost their land and starved to death. And they also died because, in general, in times of war, in particular, a war that was 100 years ago or more, there wasn't the type of medical care that was available. So some of them just died due to those reasons. Things like cholera spread rampantly in some of the more war-torn regions in Mexico. So in any event, I think you understand from the previous video, and please check that out if you haven't, that the trigger to this revolution was that the poorer population in Mexico did not benefit from any of the reforms introduced by Porfirio Diaz or Benito Juarez before him. So it's important for us to understand that there was not a one-size-fits-all response to the Mexican Revolution. There were different ideological groups that argued that there were different ways to respond to Diaz. So one of them was this figure named Emiliano Zapata. His followers were called Zapatistas, and in general, they thought the solution to the shortcomings of President Diaz was to have this major land reform overhaul. In general, what they wanted to do was restore land ownership for some of the peasant class, the 90% of peasants who lost their land because of Diaz's reforms and Juarez's reforms. Then there was my favorite out of all these leaders, Pancho Villa, and his followers did actually believe in some of the same things as Emiliano Zapata. He also believed that the rural peasants should have more rights, but also the urban workers should have more rights. Some of the reasons why there were two different leaders in the Mexican Revolution, opponents to Diaz, who believed in more or less the same thing, was because they lived in different parts of Mexico, and so their followers were more geographic. But Pancho Villa also clashed with the United States military because he was much closer to the U.S. border. So he's sort of regarded as a villain in U.S. history, but regarded as a hero of the agricultural class in Mexico. And I really wish I had a photo of Pancho Villa on here. Maybe I'll get one for you as dessert at the end of this video if I remember. But he's well known. You can recognize him from a mile away. You've probably seen a photo of him because he tends to wear a string of bullets around his neck, almost like a necklace. So it's sort of intimidating looking to people who believed in Diaz. No one wants a person who wears a necklace full of bullets coming into their town in drastic opposition to the president's current policies. And then you have more of a liberal reform. And remember from the previous videos that liberal does not mean the same thing in this context. We're really talking about the middle class, the people who owned land, the people who benefited from some of those previous policies. They believed in a liberal democracy. They believed in giving the right to vote to not all of its citizens, but those who owned land, those who in general were of a I'm not trying to subscribe to this idea, but they believe themselves to be in a superior class economically. And so they argued that having a more liberal constitution would be the way to go. And the leader of that movement was Venustiano, if I'm saying that correctly, Carranza. And eventually you're going to see that the liberal middle class ends up winning, for lack of a better word, and they just reform the constitution. So that's what this slide is about. So what we're going to see, part of the reason why Carranza ends up coming out on top of the Mexican Revolution, he was not the majority, or his followers were not the majority. By far, as you know, the majority population of Mexico overall at this time was rural and agricultural. And so the vast majority of the followers, of the opponents to Diaz, were following Zapata and Pancho Villa. In general, the middle class, the moneyed middle class, did not make up a huge proportion of the Mexican population. But nonetheless, the constitutionalists had the backing of the United States government because they wanted something similar to what the United States had, a constitution-based liberal democracy. And President Roosevelt also wanted Carranza to come out on top at the end of the revolution. So when you get the support of a country that is also not leading the charge in the First World War by any means, but they entered the First World War late, and the U.S. military was one of the reasons why the Allies won World War I. You can see how much leverage U.S. support of Carranza would have on the outcome of this revolution. So when Carranza and his followers, the constitutionalists, win this civil conflict, this civil war, they reform the Constitution. In fact, they largely just draft a brand new Constitution. If you remember from the video, 2 videos ago, there was a Constitution in 1858, also a liberal Constitution. But the Constitution of 1917 was trying to grant some concessions to these other groups of revolutionaries that we just looked at, the Zapatas and the Villistas, the followers of Pancho Villa. So first off, this is something that was slightly counter to what the U.S. would believe in, to nationalize resources. So what it means to nationalize a resource would be that the government would take over that resource. So if you remember from the previous video, the United States had invested a massive amount of money into the Mexican economy, and quite a bit of that was going towards the oil industry. Because think about it, in the period after World War I, more and more people were driving cars and relying on oil as a very valuable resource. So if the Mexican government nationalized oil, this might antagonize the United States' relationship with Mexico in the long run. Another element of a liberal democracy in general was to get rid of that connection between church and state. The Catholic Church did have quite a bit of influence in the Mexican government and Mexican society in earlier periods of Mexican history, in particular the period before the Mexican-American War. So this did make some conservatives in Mexico feel uneasy, but nonetheless it was something that was important because of that connection to the U.S. Constitution and other liberal democracies throughout the world. So also they believed that workers should have some basic rights. This is another nod to some of the more progressive revolutionaries in the Mexican Revolution. They wanted some striking rights for workers, for example. They did believe in some, I'm skipping to number 5, they did believe in some land reform, but they were more moderate, so they did not believe in restoring all the land that the indigenous people and that the rural class in general lost. And they also believed in education reform. In general, they wanted to have universal literacy in the state of Mexico. But the revolution does not stop when Carranza becomes president. You can see that this constitution was adopted in 1917, but the revolution continues for about 3 more years. And so Carranza was not regarded well by all Mexicans. In fact, many of them argued that the Constitution was more of a empty platitude, that it was just this gesture that wasn't really implemented. In particular, the rural people in Mexico were very upset at the slow pace of the land reform. And then Carranza actually had Emiliano Zapata, one of the champions of land reform that we just talked about, he had him assassinated. And so if you were a follower of Zapata, you probably were not particularly happy with Carranza's direction at that point. Carranza ends up losing the presidency in 1920, and the revolution ends right around that period. So I'm looking at the clock, we're at 9 minutes. I apologize, but we're going to do one more. It's going to be quick. It's just talking about how the Mexican Revolution impacted migration patterns. In particular, migration out of Mexico into the United States. So stay tuned for that one. Thanks for watching.